John Mearsheimer just issued his most alarming warning yet. Trump's Venezuela invasion has handed China the perfect justification to take Taiwan by force. Here's what just happened. On January 3, 2026, the United States launched a full-scale military operation against Venezuela. U.S. forces conducted airstrikes across Caracas, captured President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and flew them to the United States to face criminal charges. Trump announced that the U.S. will govern Venezuela until a safe, proper, and judicious transition occurs, with no timeline defined. This is the most audacious U.S. military intervention in Latin America in decades. And Mearsheimer believes it's a catastrophic strategic blunder. But the Venezuela intervention is only half the story. According to Mearsheimer, China has been watching everything, and the precedent America just set, invading a sovereign nation, removing its leader, and installing direct U.S. governance, gives Beijing the perfect playbook for Taiwan. Mearsheimer warned in December 2025, weeks before the invasion, that Trump's foreign policy has been an unmitigated disaster with few successes and many failures. Now with Venezuela, Trump has escalated from failure to catastrophe. And here's the shocking deal everyone's missing. This isn't about Venezuela. It's about a grand bargain Mearsheimer sees forming. The U.S. claims dominance over the Western Hemisphere through force, China claims Taiwan using the same logic, and the world accepts it as the new normal of great power competition. In this video, I'm exposing Mearsheimer's analysis of why the Venezuela invasion is a strategic disaster, how it creates a precedent for China to invade Taiwan, what this means for global oil markets and your investments, and why this could trigger World War III. But before we dive into Mearsheimer's shocking analysis, if you want to understand how geopolitical events affect your wealth and protect yourself from world-changing crises, subscribe to The Investor's Lens. We reveal what mainstream media won't tell you. Hit subscribe now. But there's one detail about the U.S. military operation in Venezuela that is by far the most unprecedented, and it reveals how dramatically American foreign policy has changed. It's direct U.S. governance. And this hasn't happened in Latin America since the early 20th century. Let me give you the timeline of what happened. On January 3, 2026, U.S. military forces launched coordinated strikes across Venezuela. Multiple targets in Caracas and other key locations were hit simultaneously. Within hours, Special Operations Forces captured President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. They weren't just detained in Venezuela. They were seized and flown out of the country on U.S. military aircraft to face criminal charges in American courts. This is extraordinary, the forced removal of a sitting head of state by a foreign power. But here's what makes this different from previous U.S. interventions. Trump didn't install a puppet government. He didn't recognize Juan Guaido or any opposition leader. Instead, Trump announced that the United States itself will govern Venezuela. Read that again. Not help Venezuela transition to democracy. Not support Venezuelan people choosing their government. The U.S. will govern Venezuela directly. This is colonial occupation in all but name. And the time frame for this transition? Undefined. It could be months. It could be years. Trump gave no clarity. Mearsheimer sees this as the culmination of failed U.S. foreign policy thinking. For decades, America justified interventions with language about democracy promotion, humanitarian intervention, and spreading liberal values. But Trump has dropped the pretense entirely. It's raw power politics. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, 304 billion barrels. It also has gold, rare earth minerals, and strategic location. Trump wants those resources under U.S. control. He's not hiding it anymore. And the justification? Trump claimed Maduro was a dictator, a threat to regional stability, and aligned with America's enemies, Russia, China, Iran. But these same arguments could justify invading dozens of countries. International reaction has been mixed but largely negative. Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, all regional powers, condemned the invasion as a violation of sovereignty. China and Russia issued strong statements calling it imperialism. Even European allies expressed concern about the precedent. But here's what Mearsheimer emphasizes. The U.S. has now demonstrated that it will use military force to remove governments it doesn't like and install direct American control. No UN authorization, no coalition of allies, just unilateral action based on perceived national interest. This is great power behavior in its rawest form. And Mearsheimer, as a realist scholar, isn't surprised that great powers act this way. What worries him is that America just created a precedent that other great powers, specifically China, will now follow. If the United States can invade Venezuela, remove its government, and govern it directly based on claims of national security and regional stability, why can't China do the same with Taiwan? China has claimed Taiwan as part of its territory for 75 years. It argues that Taiwan independence movements threaten Chinese national security. It says reunification is necessary for regional stability. These are the exact same arguments Trump used for Venezuela. Mearsheimer's warning is simple. We just showed China how to justify a Taiwan invasion. And unlike Venezuela, Taiwan actually matters strategically to the United States. That's where the real danger lies. But the precedent for China isn't the only catastrophic consequence. This next implication is perhaps the most dangerous because it could trigger a war between nuclear-armed superpowers. It's the Taiwan precedent, and China is already using Venezuela as justification for future action. Here's how Mearsheimer sees this playing out. China has been planning Taiwan reunification for decades, but they've always faced two obstacles: international condemnation and U.S. military intervention. The Venezuela invasion just eliminated the first obstacle and complicated the second. Let me explain the logic China will use. If the United States can invade a sovereign nation thousands of miles from its borders, capture its leader, and establish direct governance based solely on claims of national security, why can't China reunify with the territory it considers part of China? Taiwan is 100 miles from mainland China. Venezuela is 2,500 miles from the United States. If proximity and historical claims matter, China has a stronger case for Taiwan than America has for Venezuela. And the U.S. can't credibly criticize China anymore. American diplomats will say, Taiwan is different, it's a democracy. But Maduro was elected too, regardless of how questionable those elections were. The U.S. will say Taiwan doesn't threaten China. But China will argue that Taiwan independence movements do threaten Chinese sovereignty, just like the U.S. argued about Venezuela. Every moral and legal argument the U.S. might make against a Chinese Taiwan invasion has been undercut by the Venezuela precedent. Mearsheimer has discussed this exact scenario for years in his Great Power Politics framework. Great powers compete for regional hegemony. The United States achieved hegemony in the Western Hemisphere in the 19th and 20th centuries, partly through interventions exactly like Venezuela. China is now attempting the same thing in East Asia. And just like America wouldn't tolerate a rival power dominating Latin America, China won't tolerate U.S. dominance in its region. The Venezuela invasion tells China, the rules-based international order doesn't exist. Great powers do what they want in their spheres of influence. If the U.S. can govern Venezuela directly, China can reunify Taiwan by force. But here's where it gets terrifying. Unlike Venezuela, the United States has committed to defending Taiwan. The Taiwan Relations Act and multiple presidential statements have created an ambiguous but real security guarantee. If China invades Taiwan using Venezuela as justification, what does America do? We just set the precedent that great powers can invade countries in their sphere of influence. How do we then fight China for doing the same thing? We'd have to argue that our invasion was legitimate, but theirs isn't. That's hypocrisy China will exploit endlessly. It weakens American credibility with allies and undermines any coalition we might build against Chinese action. And there's a military calculation. Venezuela is a tiny, weak country with barely functioning armed forces. The U.S. invasion was easy. Taiwan is a modern, well-armed democracy with American weapons and training. A Chinese invasion would be a massive military operation, potentially the largest amphibious assault in history. If that invasion happens, the U.S. faces a choice: let Taiwan fall and abandon our commitments, or fight China directly in a conflict that could go nuclear. Mearsheimer believes Venezuela makes a China-Taiwan conflict more likely because it established that great powers will use force to control their regions. And in a conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, there are no winners, only different degrees of catastrophe. This is the shocking deal Mearsheimer sees forming: great powers carving up the world into spheres of influence enforced by military power. America took Venezuela, China takes Taiwan, Russia took Crimea. And we accept this as the new normal until the next great war. But there's an economic dimension everyone's ignoring. Here's the economic consequence that could affect every investor's portfolio, and it's happening right now in real time. It's the oil market disruption. And Venezuela's 304 billion barrels of proven reserves are about to reshape global energy markets. Let me explain the economics. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, larger than Saudi Arabia, 298 billion barrels, or Canada, 168 billion barrels. But under Maduro, Venezuela's oil production collapsed from 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s to barely 700,000 barrels per day in 2024. Why? Corruption, mismanagement, U.S. sanctions, and lack of investment. Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, became a cash cow for the government, with profits diverted to political spending rather than maintaining infrastructure. Oil fields and refineries degraded for decades. But now, the United States controls Venezuela, and Trump's plan, according to statements from his administration, is to restore Venezuela's oil production to benefit the American people. U.S. oil companies are about to flood into Venezuela, rebuild infrastructure, and ramp up production. Within 3 to 5 years, Venezuela could be producing 2 to 3 million barrels per day, an increase of 2.5 million barrels daily. That's a massive supply shock to global oil markets. Current global oil consumption is about 100 million barrels per day. Adding 2 million barrels from Venezuela represents a 2% increase in global supply. Economics 101. When supply increases and demand stays constant, prices fall. Oil prices, which have been trading around $70–80 per barrel in 2025, could drop to $50–60 if Venezuelan production ramps up. That's good for consumers, but terrible for oil investors. U.S. shale producers, OPEC nations, and oil-dependent economies like Russia all suffer when oil prices fall below $60. At those prices, many drilling operations become unprofitable. But there's a geopolitical calculation too. Russia and Iran are both heavily dependent on oil revenue. Lower oil prices directly hurt their ability to fund military operations and maintain domestic stability. China, as a massive oil importer, benefits from lower prices. But China also loses because Venezuela was one of its key allies and oil suppliers in Latin America. Chinese companies invested billions in Venezuelan oil projects. Those investments are now likely worthless as the U.S. takes control. So the deal Mearsheimer sees is this. The U.S. gets Venezuela's oil and hurts Russia economically. China loses an ally but might gain Taiwan. It's a grand bargain and great power competition. For investors, the implications are clear. Oil and energy stocks could decline 20 to 30% if Venezuelan production ramps up and oil prices fall to $50 to $60 per barrel. Companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips all face lower profit margins. OPEC nations will likely cut production to stabilize prices. Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others can't afford sustained low oil prices. Expect production cuts, announced in coming months. Renewable energy stocks could benefit. Lower oil prices historically slow the transition to renewables, but governments committed to climate goals might accelerate policies to prevent backsliding. Defense stocks will soar. The Venezuela intervention, plus heightened China-Taiwan tensions, means increased military spending. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman all benefit. The Venezuela invasion isn't just a geopolitical crisis, it's an economic reordering that will affect every portfolio, but Mearsheimer's biggest concern isn't economics or Taiwan. Here's Mearsheimer's ultimate warning, and it's the darkest scenario he's outlined in years. It's World War III, and the Venezuela invasion just made it more likely. Mearsheimer has spent his career studying great power conflict. His book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, argues that great powers inevitably compete for dominance, and this competition often leads to war. We're now watching that theory play out in real time. The United States, China, and Russia are the three great powers. Each wants hegemony in its region, and they're increasingly willing to use military force to achieve it. The Venezuela invasion signals that America will use military power to maintain dominance in the Western Hemisphere. China sees this and concludes it must use military power to achieve dominance in East Asia. Russia already did this in Ukraine and Georgia. When three nuclear-armed great powers are all expanding spheres of influence through military force, the probability of direct conflict increases dramatically. Here's the escalation scenario Mearsheimer fears. Step 1. U.S. governs Venezuela, faces resistance, gets bogged down, like Iraq. Step 2. China uses Venezuela precedent to justify Taiwan reunification by force. Step 3. U.S. must choose, abandon Taiwan or fight China directly. Step 4. If the U.S. fights China over Taiwan, it's a great power war. Step 5. Russia exploits U.S.-China conflict to expand in Europe or Central Asia. Step 6. Allies get dragged in. Japan, South Korea, Philippines versus China, NATO versus Russia. Step 7. Limited nuclear exchange becomes possible if one side is losing conventionally. This isn't science fiction. This is how great power wars start, through miscalculation, competing interests, and precedents that justify escalation. Mearsheimer emphasized in his December 2025 analysis that Trump's foreign policy has been a failure precisely because it increases these risks without achieving strategic objectives. The Venezuela invasion doesn't make America safer or more prosperous. It just creates more enemies and justifies rival powers taking similar actions. And unlike previous U.S. interventions in weak countries, a war with China over Taiwan would be existential. China has 2 million active military personnel, advanced missiles, and nuclear weapons. The U.S. can't just bomb China into submission like we did with Iraq or Libya. A U.S.-China war would be the deadliest conflict since World War II. Millions could die. Global trade would collapse. The world economy would enter a depression. And nuclear escalation is a real possibility. Mearsheimer isn't being alarmist. He's been studying these patterns for 50 years. And everything he's seeing now, aggressive unilateral action, great power competition, disregard for international law, points toward major war. The Venezuela invasion isn't just bad policy, it's a step toward catastrophe. So what should investors actually do? Here's exactly how to protect your wealth as great power conflict accelerates. Step 1. Reduce risk assets. If Mearsheimer is right and we're heading toward increased great power conflict, risk assets like tech stocks and growth stocks will suffer. Move 15–20% of your portfolio to defensive positions. Step 2. Buy defense stocks Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technologies, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics. These companies benefit from increased military spending. The Venezuela intervention plus Taiwan. Tensions mean defense budgets are going up globally. Step 3. Avoid Chinese exposure. Any stocks dependent on China or Taiwan supply chains are at risk. Apple, Tesla, Nvidia all have major Taiwan exposure through TSMC chip manufacturing. If China invades Taiwan, those supply chains collapse. Step 4. Buy gold and precious metals. Great power conflict drives investors to safe havens. Gold traditionally performs well during geopolitical crises. Silver, platinum, all precious metals benefit. Step 5. Energy diversification. If Venezuelan oil floods markets, prices fall. Avoid pure oil companies, but keep some energy exposure in case Middle East conflicts disrupt supply. Step 6. Build cash reserve. When uncertainty is this high, cash is king. Keep 20–30% in money market funds or treasury bills. If markets crash during a crisis, you'll have capital to buy bargains. Step 7. Geographic diversification. Don't keep all investments in U.S.-based assets. Consider international exposure to countries not involved in great power conflicts. Switzerland, Singapore, Australia. The Venezuela invasion changed the world. Position accordingly. So we've covered Mearsheimer's analysis of the shocking U.S.-China-Venezuela situation. The January 3rd U.S. military invasion that captured Maduro and established direct American governance. How this creates a precedent for China to invade Taiwan using identical justification. The oil market shock as Venezuela's 304 billion barrels come under U.S. control. Mearsheimer's warning that we're on a path to World War III through great power competition. And exactly how to position your portfolio for defense stocks, precious metals, and crisis-proof assets. These are the geopolitical realities that will reshape markets and your wealth over the next decade. But here's something I didn't tell you at the start of this video. Everything I just shared is completely useless if you don't know which specific defense. Contractors have the most Taiwan-related contracts, which commodities will explode during great power conflict, and which countries offer the safest havens for wealth. Without this specific intelligence, you'll miss the opportunities and get crushed by the risks. Comment under this video, and I will reveal the exact 7 stocks to buy before the China-Taiwan conflict escalates, and how to protect 100% of your wealth from World War III scenarios. I'll see you in the next one.